Good evening and welcome to NAC at Home. My name is Laura Daly. I'm a member of the Roundtable Committee, which is a committee committed to presenting a variety of experiences to club members and the public, as you will see later tonight. For those of you not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. The club offers more than 150 free programs annually to the public. And these programs include art exhibitions, theatrical, musical, and dance performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the club, we invite you to visit us at nationalartsclub.org, and you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Tonight, it is my great honor to present Jeanette Andrews, one of our NAC Fellows for 2023-24. She will talk about the phenomenology of surprise. What makes something surprising? What differentiates surprise from the weird, the interesting, or the startling? Are there hierarchies of surprise? Jeanette's unique practice as a magician and artist gives her a unique insight into these topics. A years-long inquiry into why certain magic effects are more surprising than others led to conversations during Andrews' time as an affiliate of MetaLab at Harvard. This then inspired her 2021 installation and performance work, Taken by Artificial Surprise. In 2023, she gave a keynote talk on this topic for a joint symposium for the British Society of Aesthetics and Science of Magic Association. She has presented numerous commissioned works with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Quebec City Biennial, Boca Raton Museum of Art. She has given talks at Cooper Hewitt, Chicago Ideas Week, the British Society of Aesthetics, numerous corporations and universities, including Columbia, MIT, and Harvard. Illusion is Andrews' life's work, and her performances have been praised by the Chicago Tribune, PBS, and the New York Times. There will be a Q&A after Jeanette's presentation, so please put your questions in the Q&A function. She will always also ask you to participate, so be ready to use the chat function. Now, please welcome Jeanette Andrews, who will show us the hazy nature of our expectations.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Jeanette Andrews. I'm so excited to be here with you. I have to take a 2-second housekeeping Zoom note and ask if you would kindly keep yourself muted during the talk. That would be amazing. But tonight, I'm so excited to be here because we get to explore this idea of surprise, which is something that has been at the forefront of my mind now for almost about 5 years. So I want to kick us off kind of with a quick thing that I feel like is a really beautiful quote to get us started, which is that surprise helps show us the edges of our experience and possibilities for a world beyond. And that comes to us by way of Matthew Battles, who was the prior director of scholarly initiatives with MetaLab at Harvard. And when he said that, those words just stuck so much in my brain. And I paused him and asked if I could write them down and later quote him on them, and he kindly agreed. And so I just feel like this is a good kind of guiding force for what we'll talk about tonight. So today we'll talk about the idea of what live magic performances can show us about this very hazy nature of surprise as seen through the lenses of culture agency, and cognition. And then throughout that arc, we'll also explore some of surprise's nearest neighbors, things like the startling, the weird, the eerie, and the interesting, and what those things show us about how we understand surprise. I was so hoping I was not going to have to do this, but it appears that I am. It is very obvious that I am getting over being incredibly sick. And so my voice is not what I was hoping it was going to be. So thanks for bearing with me and dealing with my very squeaky voice that is modulating more than I thought. But here we are. Um, Okay, so why we're talking about surprise at all, and kind of why I feel like surprise matters beyond the scope of those who might use it in a professional or artistic sense, such as myself. Surprise really is comprised of so many different components, and at least for myself, as I've started to sort of tease apart what goes into making surprise, by doing that, it has ended up showing me how it can serve as a really important tool, both in terms of its actual function and its sort of investigatory process to explore ideas like the importance of cultural context, the complexity of a causal agent for creativity, and then how really central embodied perception is in our hyper digital world. And I feel like surprise also is something that, as we'll talk about a little later on, can really highlight how we learn and form beliefs, and how our assumptions are often challenged by experiences of surprise. And a lot of times when we're met with things that are surprising due to our assumptions and expectations being challenged, a lot of times it's a way that we find things really humbling. And I feel like it's a great way that ends up connecting us to each other. So kind of for the structure of today, you'll see that I'll be posing a lot of questions. And this is very intentional because magic as a form, and as Laura was so gracious to introduce me in such a beautiful way, magic, as is my technical professional background, I feel like strives to provide more answers than questions, or more questions than answers, excuse me. And so much in that way, I hope to leave you with more questions than answers. And so too does the experience of surprise often afford us a meta-reflective experience. And in those sort of internally reflective experiences, we're forced to sort of question our judgments and expectations and experiences. Those sort of experiences of surprise are very evocative of questions as well. So that being said, the guiding question that kicked off this whole thing for me was, why are some magic performances, some magic effects in particular, more surprising than others? I'll come back to the preface on this and the story of what drove me to explore this a little bit later on. But first, I want to show you a piece of magic that I feel like by its very nature is either arguably not surprising at all, or maybe just not terribly surprising. So I'll show you what I mean. And this is one of my favorite pieces of magic to show people. It's one of the first we have in recorded human history. And we know this dates back to at least 1584, to the first book ever published on magic in the Western world. And it uses just a couple of small items, which are a candle and a spool of thread. I'm gonna go back to my larger screen. This image represents what is certain, and it's the picture I hope to leave you with in the end. So I would argue, kind of based on some of the things that I'll show you, that that is a piece of magic that is not terribly surprising. And here's why. Um, I'll start off with first, kind of as a baseline, an idea of exploring magic and the seemingly impossible. Because as many, I'm curious to know, and we can get into it in the Q&A a little bit later, but I'm guessing a number of people watching this have a background either in magic or something sort of adjacent. So you may already be familiar with Jason Ludington's work. If you are, amazing, he's great. If not, he's a philosopher. He's one of the main philosophers in the world studying magic and looking at it sort of in terms of it's what it shows us about experience. And he gives a definition of magic as presenting a moment that is impossible and yet, as far as you can tell, happened anyway. And that it's not necessarily about deceiving, but it's about creating an illusion and the illusion of impossibility. So I think that's a good kind of baseline for us to start with in terms of how we think about the impossible. So things that are impossible versus surprising. So things that are surprising often tend to give us a feeling of having a what question instead of a how, who, where, or what, or why questions. Sometimes those come in later, but a lot of times surprise tends to first start out with a what question, a question of what just happened, what did I just see, because we are taken by surprise, as opposed to how did something happen, or who was behind creating something. And so this is a framework we'll also kind of look at as we kind of explore and pull apart aspects of surprise. But this idea of the how, I feel like points to the idea of impossibility. Because with what you just saw, you probably were not questioning what was going to happen. You knew what was going to happen. Every person who has a cultural basic framework of what a magician is, what a magic show is, um, understands that if you see a magician take out any whole object and then any sort of implement of destruction, whether that be a knife, a lighter, a pair of scissors, they tear something, they burn something, you know, by the wealth of tropes that are associated with magic in our contemporary world, that it is basically under the purview of the job of the magician to restore the thing that was destroyed. So therefore, your expectation of what is going to happen, you already know. And so you're not sort of faced with a what question at the end of that piece of magic with the thread. You're really more faced with a how question, which leans into the impossibility of it, which is what I'll get into a little bit here. So this is something that I feel like is quite interesting. Again, this is kind of talking about how this idea of a cut and restored sort of category of magic effect gets to this idea. There are, depending on who you read in magic theory and scholarship, anywhere between 7 to 21 categories of magic effects. Things like vanishes, appearances, transformations, levitations, things like that. So this sort of cut and restored effect is really neatly bracketed into one of those categories. And as a result, then because you have such a clear expectation of what that is, the idea of then the impossibility of it is more heightened rather than the surprise. So in this case, because again, I framed myself as a magician, I was introduced that way, you understand the expectation of the arc that that object will take. We also are very used to the idea of how spools of thread behave, how they are typically in long pieces. If something is cut in tiny pieces, we're used to how they sort of behave in their sort of normative states. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But this is a great example of something that I would argue is, again, kind of skewing more impossible and less surprising. So this takes me essentially to the why we're even here, the preface to this story, which is really that, and I'll just kind of toggle back and forth as we chat. But that basically it was 2017, I was so kindly asked by the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago area, and I know my parents are watching on this Zoom, so I have to give a shout out to them and say hello and thank you. And so I was asked in 2017 by the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago to create a piece of magic that would be a commission for their 50th anniversary that was paying homage to the 1969 large-scale building wrap by the artist Christo and Jean-Claude. And so I ended up doing this piece, which essentially was a very much more grand scale of what you just saw. I was using about a 30-foot length of cloth to then be cut in the hands of spectators, tied back together and restored. And in about a year of working on that, I was deeply frustrated for probably the first 6 months as to why it didn't feel magical to me somehow. And I finally figured out part of the way through that it was because it didn't feel surprising. It seemed to lack an element of surprise. And so I started to sort of pit different things against each other in my head in terms of pieces of magic that I have performed, in terms of how surprising they seem to be or not. And I was really kept being kind of struck by there's one piece of magic that honestly just does not compute over Zoom, that I've performed for now close to 25 years. And it is something that is deeply surprising. And I just started to kind of go on this quest to figure out why something that I was used to performing and had spent, 2.5 decades kind of refining and refining and refining something really kind of straightforward and beautiful, why that was so deeply surprising. And then this other piece that I was working on, like the fabric and like the thread, seemed to be sort of devoid of that in a major way. So that is what took us there. And so this is actually an image from a later performance of that, but so you can at least see kind of the scale of what I'm talking about. So today we'll talk about not only sort of what is surprise, but then also some of these near neighbors, things like the weird, the eerie, and the interesting along the way. So right now we'll jump into an idea about culture and what sort of cultural context and cultural milieus can show us about what may or may not afford experiences of surprise. So to start off in sort of an etymology standpoint and move to sort of a colloquial usage, we actually see this in what may not be surprising to you, beginning as a military term. We see that dating back to Old French from the 13th century, to be taken unawares. And so we see a lot of these early definitions, both the noun and the verb form, being shown as these essentially very physical acts of being taken over or taken unaware or things like that. And then what's interesting is then as you look through in about the 1500s, 1600s, you start to see it move from this physical enactment to a cognitive state. And just a parallel that I'll point out that I found of note was the parallel between the Enlightenment, the Copernican Revolution, etc., and the way that we start to see the emergence of the self and the sort of internal world come about around that time. So it's very interesting to just see that sort of move towards the internalized cognition of surprise. And it moved from a really negative connotation in a military sense to this sort of more enlightened connotation, and then almost traverse back in its colloquial usage to, if I were to say, complete the blank, I'm going to a surprise, you'd say party. And so there we see it kind of back to a physical enactment again, but with a positive connotation. So I just find that sort of social arc really interesting. This is a quote that I assume everyone is familiar with, but that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's from Arthur C. Clarke, from his famous Clarke's Laws. But this is another factor in terms of how we think about what is perceived here. He's speaking specifically to what is magical or not within society as it pertains to technology. So obviously, right now, that like this thing, this is magic to me. Us being able to talk over Zoom, that is quite magical. It's also, this is all relatively new technology within our time. I'll point out one of my favorite examples of this. This is Jean Neville Mascaline. He was one of the 19th century's kind of most famous, arguably maybe the most famous magician of the time, and his automaton Psycho. So basically he would perform a lot of times almost a question and answer style uh, demonstration or performance with this kind of puppet, dummy, automated figure, however you want to think about it, almost like an early robot that essentially would have a hand that would sort of click to these different cards that you'll see in this sort of kind of front position here. But the thing that really got people and really surprised people was how it's sitting atop this glass pedestal. And so people are like, it's being controlled, but there's nothing touching it. So that was one of the things that was a primary kind of magic and surprise within this particular context. Now, this is not a surprising idea to us. I had on Bluetooth headphones yesterday. The idea of something being remotely controlled is not surprising. And I will share with you, this is very public knowledge, so I don't feel like it's unethical for me to do so. But what was fascinating about this was that this was actually done via air pressure. So essentially it was controlled via different levers being moved in this sort of compression kind of spring here, essentially being compressed or not via air pressure that was pumped through that clear pedestal. So the idea of this very controlled flow of air was a, kind of newer technology within this certain context. And again, this idea of physical movement or a real life action being controlled through some invisible means was something that was, kind of, I don't want to say sci-fi, but very much so of the time, which this takes us to our idea. If we think about, this is a writer and anthropologist, Mark Fisher. Many of you may know him from his work, basically kind of on technology and ways that he's kind of thought about this. But he talks about things that are weird, that we consider weird in the world, as being something that shows a distinct view of the inside, but from the outside. And things that, as a kind of furtherance of this thought, maybe seem out of place or out of time or out of some sort of norm in culture or cultural milieu. So that's how we sort of see that sometimes things that maybe seem weird have an adjacency to surprise or may be a component of it. So I'd love to talk now about the idea of agency and surprise and things that perhaps when we think about causality of surprise. And here there's a nice arc, I think, between how we think about the technological and agency and things like the eerie, which again brings us back to Mark Fisher. And he has this shared in one of my favorite books, probably of the last 4 or 5 years, which is called The Weird and the Eerie. And he talks about how things that are eerie often give us that sense because they seem to be devoid of a known causal agent. We think of them as being oftentimes not inhabiting closed or domestic spaces, but things that are often in vast landscapes. Things like, did you hear that eerie cry in the distance? Things that maybe don't have a readily known causal agent, or maybe something that we can't pinpoint as having a known causal agent at all. So that's another one of our kind of near neighbors that hopefully all of this will kind of come together in the end. But coming back to our leading question of why some magic effects are more surprising than others. This was something that I started thinking really deeply on in 2019, and I came across a paper which so articulately outlined almost exactly what had been rattling around in my head and put a really beautiful sort of cap on it, but through the lens of interestingness as opposed to surprise. And this was the paper by Thomas Griffiths, who's a cognitive scientist, called Revealing Ontological Commitments by Magic. So yes, this is real. And yes, apply for that grant you want because there is funding for everything. No, I'm kidding. I know Thomas is amazing and his work is incredible. But this paper, basically what he did is there were 3 different experiments that he ran, but the first one of which, and the one that was the most interesting to me, was they asked participants and gave them a written prompt saying that basically you're working as a magician's assistant. We want you to come up with the most interesting magic trick that is a transformation of these sets of objects. And they basically gave them pairwise comparisons of a number of different objects. Things like glasses of water, glasses of milk, bricks, daffodils, doves, human beings, a litany of things. And then ask them to sort of rate how interesting those transformations would be. And so before I kind of move too far forward away from that, one of the things that they found were quite interesting, and that were people rated things more interesting if they had kind of ontic points of symmetry and asymmetry, meaning that there was something in terms of what constituted our understanding of the object that was both similar and dissimilar across the transformation. So, for example, if you think about things that are like a transformation, like a glass of water to a glass of milk, that has sort of these ontological commitments that are similar in terms of that they're both liquids, they're both a similar size, etc. The color is different. So that's a point of sort of ontic asymmetry or ontological asymmetry. The other thing they found was that moving up a hierarchy of things that had a higher animacy or higher levels of intelligence, of course, drew more interest. So transforming inanimate objects to animals or people drew more interest from people. So one of the things that I feel like this kind of also brings into the fore is how we think about the idea just in this sort of gut sense of what makes sense to us or not. And so this brings me to this great quote by Teller, which is of Penn and Teller, the famous magic duo, where he says that magic is the theatrical linking of a cause with an effect that has no basis in physical reality, but that in our hearts feels like it ought to. So there's this ought to-ness that I think is a lot of what is driving those sort of symmetric points of ontological symmetry. I feel like that is a lot of what is happening in that ought to feeling. So as I thought about this paper a lot more, I kind of extended it into some of my thoughts on surprise and how some of these transformations seemed to basically point to what is more or less surprising based on these 4 factors. And I'm only speaking about sort of categorically transformations of objects within magic performances. So this very narrow band of what I'm speaking about here. But basically looking at scale, color, animacy, and material. So for example, if we think about 2 of these kind of pairwise transformations, a glass of water to a glass of milk, those 2 things, the scale is the same, the color is different. That's the point of asymmetry. The animacy level is the same, it's liquid to liquid, and the material is the same. And then if we think about something like glass of milk to dove, here we have basically the scale is similar. It's not glass of milk to building. We have the color is the same. The animacy is on an upward trajectory. You're moving to a more animate being. And then the material is obviously different. And yet there's also this kind of odd connection between the 2 in a way that if you're moving from milk to a dove and feathers, there's still kind of a fluidity and a softness. It's not a brick. So there's still almost a marginal point of symmetry there. So I feel like, and as I thought about this, even the most narrow slice of just looking about surprising surprising transformation of objects within magic performances, I was like, oh my God, this is so complicated. Even just trying to sort of tease apart why this sliver of experience is surprising. And so that ended up, I was thinking on all of this at the same time, and I'm going to jump back again. I was thinking on all of this at the same time that I was fortunate enough to be an affiliate of MetaLab with Harvard, which is a digital humanities lab. And during one of our meetings, this was all on Zoom during kind of peak COVID days. I saw that on our agenda for the next week's Zoom meeting was going to be a presentation by Dario Rodriglio, who's an amazing data viz scientist that he kind of toggles between the East Coast and Europe. And his presentation was titled Surprise Machines. And I was like, oh my God, somebody's going to be talking about surprise. I'm so excited. And so I emailed him and just said, I'm so excited to hear your presentation about surprise. And he said, have you read the original 1950 Alan Turing paper? And I'm thinking to myself, because I was kind of unexpectedly thrust into this digital humanities space. And I kind of was like, no, dude, no, I have not. And he was like, read it. I think you'll really appreciate it because there's a really interesting argument in it that's very central to not only that paper, but now all of basically computer science moving forward on whether or not a machine can take us by surprise. Unbeknownst to him at the time was that surprise had become such a big focus of my life. So in the 1950 Alan Turing paper, here, this is a little slice of it, is basically Turing refutes a point made by the 19th century mathematician and arguably the world's first computer programmer, Ada Lovelace, and what is now the famous Lovelace refutation. And in that, basically, she kind of makes this argument that a machine cannot take a human by surprise because we as humans have designed it and therefore understand all of its functionality, all the ways it can break down, outputs it can have, etc. So then decades later, Turing basically said, machines take me by surprise all the time. And it was through this exploration that, bringing back our friend from slide one, Matthew Battles, who was really kind of at the fore of looking at a lot of interconnected research at the time and constantly, he posed the question to me saying, a lot of the language that was used in the furtherance of this argument, which gave rise to the original Turing test, which is basically what you encounter every time you do like a reCAPTCHA and infuriatingly have to explain that you're a human because you know what a bicycle or a car is. Basically, so much of the original really beautiful thought experiment that started that was pulling from the visual language and visual imagery of the original of a lot of Victorian parlor games. And so Matthew posed to me, he said, there's a lot of, this Victorian parlor game language. It seems very adjacent to parlor magic of the time. Is that correct? And I said, yes, they literally live in the same books. And he said, that's interesting. Is Victorian parlor magic something in your wheelhouse? And I said, yes. And he said, is Victorian parlor magic an interesting way to explore this question of whether or not a machine can take a human by surprise? And I was like, absolutely. And that beautiful provocation from him is what gave rise to then the project I spent the next year and a half of my life working on, which was called Taken by Artificial Surprise, where I worked with Doug Duhame, who at the time was working with Yale's Digital Humanities Lab. And we trained an algorithm based on 19th century magic catalogs, which provide just a wealth of descriptions of magic effects. And then trained an algorithm basically to swap the nouns in and out of different magic effects based on sort of my scales of surprise based on the Griffiths paper, based on scale, color, animacy, and material, and be toggling these through to essentially create new and novel descriptions for magic effects. What resulted was an installation and performance where basically the audience was welcomed into a giant live Turing test, where people would come in and would be told that they would see pieces of magic unfold that would be either things that were descriptions of pieces of magic that were generated with the help of machine learning, or pieces of magic that were historic pieces of magic that I were presenting with my own kind of modern day twists. These were chosen via the roll of a die and things hidden in black boxes. And so people would roll dice, whatever object they kind of pulled out of the corresponding numbered box, I would perform a piece of magic with. And it was left completely unsaid whether or not what they had seen was something from this machine generated descriptions of magic or something that was a genuinely historic, completely human generated piece of magic. And so as a result, you had just kind of a lot of weirdness pitted against a lot of weirdness. So it left people with this question of how can I tease out what is surprising in light of computer generation and what is surprising in light of, centuries, millennia of human expertise. Obviously, we see this a lot more now when we see sort of side by sides of AI generated content, whether that be images, now videos, etc. But a couple of years ago, this was much more novel, and so it was definitely sort of a way to kind of think about how we tease out these ideas of what we feel in a very almost physical sense is surprising or not. So I'll show you a clip from this now. Here we go. Okay, so I will probably go over this a little bit more quickly, to be honest with you, just for the sake of time, since we're already at 6:40 and I have a couple other longer points to talk about. But as you may or may not guess, people after the performances, I was met a lot with the question of people being like, well, which was which? And people wanted to know. And I always kind of gave a moment of pause and said, I can tell you, but do you really want to know? And almost every time people were like, actually, no. And they wanted that time to kind of have that meta reflection on it, or not meta reflection, but they wanted to actively reflect on what was sort of that initial meta reflection in surprise. Um, Hopefully we've seen so far how the idea of the creation of many things that are surprising, and especially magic in particular, is this combination of long-standing tropes with sort of these shifting cultural ideologies and norms and new technologies. And so having to do that, I have no doubt that machine learning will catch up to that. But at least at the time I was doing that, that was just too kind of overly robust at the time. Um, and in terms of the also creation of it, magic does rely on having a really deeply embedded awareness of so many things that sort of make up a visual scene, if nothing else, around you, to be able to essentially you're trying to completely recreate a scene of reality as faithfully as humanly possible. And so there's really no room for like little flaws or little gaps or things like that. And so you have to understand in a really deep cultural way, like, okay, if I'm going to have, a coffee cup sitting somewhere, I need to go and get a coffee cup from a local coffee place that is on that block, or something like that. There's a lot of stuff like that that you as a human creator just have to know how to pull in. One last thing I'll say on this before I move on is one of the things that I feel like obviously most machine learning is trained to recognize and further and predict and create based on patterns. And not only a surprise based on breaking patterns, but it's also, if you look at surprise within magic, magic is specifically designed to be inefficient, because you're having to recreate these scenes of reality that are done in a very intentionally inefficient way to create something that hopefully is seemingly impossible or surprising. Um, Unfortunately, I'll probably have to gloss over this because I just want to make sure we have time for the end. But just a couple of questions to toss out to you all, in terms of questions on whether or not surprise has to have, agents and causation that is known by the experiencers, if that is a necessary component of surprise. I have a lot of thoughts on all of this, which we don't have time to get into right now, but what the intent of a causal agent may be, and then does that perceiver have to know what that intent is? I already chatted a little bit on this in terms of magic does rely on embodied actors both presenting and perceiving it. Because a lot of times in recreating these scenes of reality, there are so many sort of on the fly things that have to change to be constantly making sure that that scene of reality stays within those bounds that we've created. So a lot of times that may be moving a prop, moving a person, having somebody do something different. I can't really divulge much more than that. But there's a lot that we as magicians have to be constantly, I mean, second by second, adjusting on the fly, and to keep what seems like a relatively static image or static situation or set of conditions. And so again, that's the sort of thing that machine learning is just not really set up to do, or to create an understanding of how to make something like that over a long arc of time. Um, this brings me to one of my favorite examples of how we look at the idea of expertise within surprise, which of course relates to ideas and expectation. But this was a great study done by Amory Danek, who's a psychologist who uses magic as a research tool to study moments of insight and problem solving. And basically, she and her colleagues, I think Gustav Kuhn might have been on this as well. I'm guessing many people watching this are familiar with his work, but basically they had two sets of participants watch a magic trick while being viewed under fMRI. And the magicians and non-magicians basically witnessed two completely different events. They actually had entirely different brain activation, and they just saw two totally different things. And the non-magicians were surprised by what they saw, and the magicians were not, because A, of course, they were expecting it, and B, it relied so much on their visual expertise. and being able to really make those sort of minute predictions based on having a complete back end of understanding of the category of type of effect that they were seeing and exactly when certain technical things would unfold. Which I feel like brings us to our last topic for today on cognition. Um, and we'll look at magic and surprise versus the interesting. Interest is something that is used a lot in research today, as is used to study sort of an increase in attention, often inspiring active learning or onboarding of knowledge. And we oftentimes see interest measured in terms of increase in looking times. We see this a lot in early childhood studies, that many, the most probably noted scholar on this is René Bergeron, who studied a lot of or things in early studies on object permanence in children. And she looked a lot at how things are viewed in light of possible and impossible conditions, and then by extension, how that was later viewed by surprise, and then what that taught us about surprise and learning. So this was an example from one of her early examples, of looking at, basically they would just have a screen kind of go down and stop and hit a block. And so you would expect it to kind of stop versus their then impossible event where they would have the block and then somehow the screen would just kind of keep going past it as their impossible event, and viewing and calculating the infant's looking time to the seemingly impossible event, whether that was taken in as new learned knowledge or not. This obviously is brought into our world today in terms of infant studies now, in terms of looking at that we can't explain the idea, sort of coming back to those what versus how questions. A lot of times surprise corresponds to I didn't expect that to happen, or that's kind of that what question versus I can't explain why that happened. So that is something we see a lot in a lot of these kind of learning and interest and surprise and things that are kind of congealing into ideas in those arenas. I'll show you a quick clip of this. Is something from one of these early childhood studies that is more recent in terms of how we think about something now, depending on if you're looking at it from philosophy, it's usually called naive physics, from cognitive science, often called intuitive physics. This is one of these studies in terms of observing unexpected, observing the unexpected enhances infants' learning. In terms of how we look at surprising events. So there we see a lot about how surprise kind of violates our physical laws of just the world around us and sort of the laws of physics, and how things like that are perceived even by incredibly young children and infants. And they've studied this, I know, as far as 2-month-old infants, and what this shows about kind of expectation violation, surprise, and learning. Here, I'll quickly wrap up on some of this because I'm nearly out of time, but on I'm probably gonna have to skip over a whole section, but one thing just more on surprise and intuitive physics was basically that what people find surprising often differs whether they're kind of judging it on a moment to moment or whether they've had time to reflect on explaining something in retrospect. This was coming from another kind of intuitive physics study that was not dissimilar from some of the videos and images you'd seen before. But this points to how important kind of reflection and judgment is to the experience of surprise, and what this shows us also about how belief is formed. So belief seems to be a central factor for the capacity to be surprised. This is a great paper by Elizabeth Cook on the phenomenology of error and surprise, and error is a whole other topic that sometimes I talk about in the machine learning and surprise aspect of it. But we think about surprise and belief basically gives us this moment essentially for meta judgment, because basically we know that we have this moment that we have aired, essentially, that something has defied our expectation, or something is just not met with what we're thinking in the way that we thought. And so we understand that we are surprised. And so there is also then that kind of judgment based on top of then what we are surprised about. And then how we sort of deconstruct what we believe and whether we believed that to be true or not, and then whether that's something we essentially onboard as new knowledge. There's the idea almost of like a Goldilocks situation in whether things that are surprising or unexpected become essentially become learned. If I see something that is so wildly surprising, it may seem anomalous, and I may not take that. It may not change my sort of mental conceptual category of something. As opposed to if I see something that is so minorly surprising, like if I see that I left my keys in a different place than I normally do, that's very minor. It's not changing my mental category of keys or my own behavior or anything like that. But there's some kind of sweet spot in the middle that's when we start to learn. Um, this is probably, unfortunately, the final point I'll have time to talk on for tonight, because I want to show you one more piece of magic, which is basically the idea of a leaf, which is basically holding concurrent states of rational kind of reason and visceral stimuli. This is an idea that comes to us from the philosopher Tamar Gendler. She's the dean of philosophy at Yale, and she coined this term a bit ago after being on a trip with her family to the Grand Canyon and walking out on that glass bottom skywalk observatory. And basically, we know rationally that that is safe and stable and secure. And there's been millions of dollars and tons of structural engineers and all this stuff that has gone into making this happen. And yet, we're met with such a stark, visceral reaction that it's really hard to kind of fight that. So you basically have these two kind of concurrent things happening. So one great thing that she says about it is that beliefs are conscious responses to things as we think that they are, and a-leafs, which is sort of the concurrent holding, is responses to how they seem. So you can kind of consciously, rationally believe something while a-leaving another thing. So I think this in a final note here speaks to sort of cognitive shifts that sometimes happen in magic. So if we come back to our thoughts on the beginning, that a magic performance, as framed as such, essentially you are about to be deceived, or in Lettington's word, basically see some moment of impossibility, and then you understand this is the bracketing of the experience that you're seeing. So you're going into it with this sort of state of disbelief or mistrust or skepticism. And then you're eventually kind of lulled back into your normal state of reasoning, usually backed by sort of concrete, culturally normative actions or visuals that are presented within this like perfect framing of context, etc. Because if you see a magic performance with things that are like a little too ambiguous, or something seems a little off, you jump right back to that state of kind of suspicion and disbelief and mistrust again. So it's usually that this first kind of initial like fold or swing from disbelief to then reason and ration, and then kind of met with some phenomenon that a lot of times is kind of unfolded in this very visceral way that defies your expectations, while you're sort of concurrently holding that state of belief and also that state of reason. And then you're sort of met with this incredible, impossible, and yet surprising seeming thing that's all sort of woven together and linked through this idea. Sadly, I do not have time to talk about the startling and the surprising. This is a lot you can probably surmise on your own. Obviously, things that are startling to us oftentimes are considered sort of more of a biological reflex to a sensory stimuli. I have a whole other talk that I do just on that is really more of just a phenomenology talk on kind of how we think about the perceptual field, getting into things like embodiment, a lot on Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of my favorite philosophers, a lot on Alvin Noe and Graham Harvin and how they look at object-oriented ontology and things like this. So I'm happy to jump into any of this in the questions, but that to be said, a couple of things on sort of wondering if these near neighbors show us what might be some of the distinguishing features of surprise, which are they do seem to need things that are surprising, sort of seem to need these points of symmetry and asymmetry in our sort of ontological commitments about them. Ontological commitments being the sort of states that basically the commitments that we have towards their states of being or knowledge about what makes them what they are. Surprise usually seems to have a known intentionally acting causal agent. As opposed to things that are startling, surprise usually entails cognition and belief, and it may or may not be onboarded as new knowledge. So in the kind of more philosophy adjacent means, I'll kind of posit this, which is that maybe this means the surprise is sort of a temporally extended sensory and cognitive reaction, sort of contradictory states of reason and visceral stimuli that are intentionally presented by a known actor and perceived by embodied agents that are relevant to an exact cultural context. So that's a current thought on surprise. I do want to show you one last quick piece of magic. I want to make sure to announce our fellows show we have coming up on Monday, June 3rd, with myself and all of the other National Arts Club fellows. And then I'll be doing another in-person event with the roundtable on September 17th. And then also, if you want these slides, that's the link. I'll leave it up for a second. And obviously, I'm very easily findable. And one last thing to toss out is I'm curious if anybody noticed some of the changes that happened in my background throughout. The color and number of the candles changed, the color of the books changed, the number of the books, etc. So just a little kind of subtle surprise for you to reflect on. And I'll toss it back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was fabulous. We do have some questions, but I know we're out of time. But people are still here, so let's get to some
Great.
of
Let's do it.
them. So, what do you think living in a highly technological and fast-paced society has on people's impression of magic?
Oh, it's interesting, right? Because it, it it speaks to the need for it now more than ever, and it speaks to um maybe my like slightly unpopular opinion about liveness, which I fully realize the contradiction of and like hypocrisy of what I'm saying right now, given that we're on a Zoom. But I am a big proponent of magic being done live. And how I have specific things that are only designed to be done live and seen by the human eye live. Because for example, like anybody knows that like your 4-year-old nephew can make a movie, an iMovie better than I can. Like we know that. And so that sort of like cultural evolution, technological evolution, people want to see something that is still amazing to them,
Mhm.
but that they understand is not digitally manipulated. And I think we're only seeing this in an accelerated pace. There's a very different sort of visceral reaction when, especially in close-up and parlor magic, which is what I do, when you see a piece of magic and it happens like inches away from you or in your own hands, if you're watching close-up magic, you're not questioning any digital manipulation. There isn't that. And I think too, people like certainly throughout COVID, and I think we're all still in this, as people are like, no, I want to like see a live real thing. And so I think magic points to sort of the robustness and complexity of our live perceptual sensory experience. And I think people will crave that and will continue to crave that more.
I agree. I agree. One other question. Let's see. Have you seen interesting ways in which magic varies across culture or different tricks by culture?
Yeah, I have, and I also am not a scholar in that. So I want to be, respectful in what I say, because I'm not somebody who is looking at that. The number one source for that, just period, is Graham Jones. Graham Jones is an anthropologist and now has become a dear friend, and he's devoted his life to studying the anthropology of magic. And he looks at instances of basically this exact question of how different cultures have viewed different have viewed magic. And one that he cites in one of his books, he has two books, Magic's Reason, which is more recent, and Trade of the Tricks, which I have to think about every time I say, both of which are some of my favorite books I've ever read. Like, you need to buy them as soon as you get off this Zoom. Um, is he talks about, there's a famous instance of Robert Houdin, who's the kind of famed parlor magician from France from the kind of mid to late 1800s, and him basically being utilized as a tool of colonialism for the French government in Africa. And it's a really weird story of basically him being brought into a culture that had a lot of ritual and a lot of superstition baked into a lot of that ritual, and basically kind of using magic to capitalize on that and kind of use people's beliefs against them, kind of as a means to exert power and to show why he personally was more powerful, and by extension the French military. So yeah, so that's a piece where basically he was showing that there was a very small box that he as the magician could very easily lift, and then he brought in one of sort of like the elders from this community, and who I think was a really large man, and then basically tried to have this man lift this box, and he was unable to lift it. And so that's like a kind of unhappy example. But there's a lot more. Check out Graham Jones. He's just an amazing, fascinating, cool person who you should be following regardless.
Let's see. Another interesting question is, what is your favorite analogy to describe the relationship between magician and audience?
Oh my God.
It's a good one.
Um, that's great.
That's a good one.
Favorite analogy between magician and audience? Um, I'm gonna have to really think on that. Um, I don't know. The only I've got about 600 things running through my mind, but none of them are quite right. The only thing that is loosely parallel to this is in terms of overall describing the relationship of the magician to magic itself, and then by extension how that's presented to the relationship to the audience. So this was posed by Topaz, who's a German magician, and I think he put this out in the 90s, maybe early aughts. Basically, this framework of an analogy of a crime scene, um, of saying the magician is acting kind of in that sort of causal agent way as either killer, victim, or witness. And so the most common trope that we see in contemporary culture is like magician as killer, like I did this thing, I perpetrated this amazing thing. And then we see like the victim, where again I'm using that word in the context of him using it from like 30, 40 years ago, um in in the idea of like the magic is happening to you or at you. If you think about like Sorcerer's Apprentice, Fantasia, like the magic is sort of spinning out of control. You are just like at its mercy. And usually we see that in comedy magic. So a lot of comedians employ that. Um, and then what to me is the most interesting of the three, which is the witness, which is where like you as the magician are kind of just standing alongside this thing and either like reporting back on it to an audience or just kind of co-seeing it with them and just being like, here's this weird thing. Are you seeing this? Um, so that's kind of the closest thing I can come up with, but I'm gonna be thinking on this the rest of the night.
That's okay. Come September 17th for your event. Maybe we can come back.
Yeah.
So, Honey Bunch, your voice is we
It's
will
toast. It's toast,
it's
I know.
so I think I want to thank everybody for attending this. It was fabulous. You were a real trooper, Jeanette. I have to say
Oh,
this was great. But go to bed and have a hot honey
I'm good. I'm
whiskey and
good.
honey, and you'll be all set for
I'll
another
be
week.
fine. I'll be fine.
So, thanks everyone for joining us for this great event, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good
Yes,
night.
thank you.
Night.